Henry VIII and his 6 wives, secrets behind the throne, whispers in the shadows. In the frigid corridors of Hampton Court Palace, the flickering light of candles cast eerie shadows on the gray stone walls. The wind howled through the crevices, blending with the hurried footsteps of a tall, broad-shouldered man who walked with a gait both arrogant and burdened. It was Henry VIII, King of England, a man both revered and feared across Europe. The year was 1536, and he stood at a fateful crossroads. Henry paused before an intricately carved wooden door, his hand gripping the hilt of the sword at his side. Beyond that door was Anne Boleyn, his second wife, the woman he had once loved to the point of madness, for whom he had defied the Roman Church itself to claim. But now, that love had turned to ashes, replaced by a gnawing suspicion that ate at his heart. Whispers in the court, the furtive glances of his advisers, and strange dreams of a blood-soaked throne, all pointed to one truth. Anne was no longer someone he could trust. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Anne sat by the window, her long black hair cascading down her back, her sharp eyes gazing into the night. She didn't turn around, but her voice cut through the silence, cold and piercing like a blade. "Have you come to end it all, Your Majesty?" Henry didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, his gaze locked on the face that had once enchanted him. Now, he saw only an enemy. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice low like rolling thunder. "The throne, glory, my love. And what have you given me in return? Betrayal as fleeting as a passing breeze." Anne laughed, the sound like a needle piercing Henry's pride. "Betrayal? You speak of betrayal when it was you who caged me in this golden prison, only to cast me aside when I couldn't bear you a prince. I'm not a doll for you to toy with, Henry." That night, their conversation stretched until the first light of dawn crept through the window. No one knew exactly what was said, but mere days later, Anne Boleyn was led to the scaffold. The axe fell with a sickening thud, her head rolling across the cold stone. Henry watched from a distance, his face devoid of expression. But deep within, a question haunted him. Had he truly been right to believe those accusations? Catherine of Aragon, the forgotten wife. Rain poured relentlessly over the docks of Dover, cold droplets mingling with the rhythmic crash of waves against the wooden hull of a Spanish ship. On October 2nd, 1501, a 16-year-old girl stepped onto English soil, her golden embroidered shoes sinking into the muddy ground. Catherine of Aragon, Princess of Castile and Aragon, lifted her gaze to the gray, brooding sky of England, a land that would become her home, though she had never wished to leave the sun-drenched plains of her native Spain. Her golden hair clung to her face, drenched and heavy, framing a delicate visage where resolute blue eyes flickered with both strength and a whisper of unease. She had come to marry Arthur, the eldest son of King Henry VII, a union arranged since their infancy to cement an alliance between England and Spain. The wedding took place at St. Paul's Cathedral amidst ringing bells and the curious stares of the crowd. Arthur, a frail boy with a timid smile, took her hand in a ceremony filled with promise. But that promise lasted mere months. A cruel fever snatched Arthur away in April 1502, leaving Catherine a widow, stranded in a foreign court. She penned a trembling letter to Spain. "I know not what will become of me, but I will not forsake my family's honor." Her parents, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, urged her to endure. Her fate seemed sealed until Henry VII proposed a bold plan. She would remain in England to wed his younger son, Henry, then only 11 when he came of age. Catherine nodded, not out of love, but duty to her dynasty. The years of waiting stretched on in silence. She learned English, read books, and prayed in the cold, shadowed chambers of Ludlow Castle, where darkness seemed to swallow every shred of hope. On June 11th, 1509, a rare sun broke through the clouds over London, casting light on the stone streets leading to St. Paul's Cathedral. Henry VIII, now 18, emerged from a royal carriage in a crimson robe threaded with gold, his chestnut hair gleaming beneath a crown. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a radiant smile and piercing blue eyes brimming with ambition, he was a king in his prime. That day he ascended the throne of England and married Catherine, the woman who had waited for him through 7 long years. Catherine entered the cathedral in a cream gown, a long veil trailing behind her, her face a blend of gentle beauty and steely resolve. As Henry took her hand, she felt the strength in his grip, but glimpsed a flicker of impulsiveness in his eyes. The ceremony echoed with hymns, and the crowd cheered as they emerged arm in arm. That night, in the royal bedchamber at Greenwich Palace, Henry pulled her close, whispering, "You will be my queen, and we will build a mighty dynasty." Catherine smiled, believing at last that fate had turned in her favor. Their early marriage was a dream. Henry, youthful and passionate, swept Catherine into lavish feasts and hunting trips. She, with her sharp intellect, became his silent confidant in negotiations with Spanish envoys. Once, in the forest near Windsor, Henry felled a great stag and rushed to embrace her, shouting, "This is for you, my love." She laughed softly, her heart swelling with hope for the children who would crown their union. But the dream soon crumbled. In 1510, Catherine's first pregnancy ended in a stillbirth. The next year, a son named Henry was born, only to die after 52 days. Miscarriage followed miscarriage, each loss a hammer blow to her spirit. She spent hours kneeling in the chapel, praying for a child, until 1516, when she bore Mary, a healthy girl with her father's eyes. Henry kissed her forehead, saying, "You've given me a jewel." But she knew, deep down, he craved a son. Time passed, and Henry changed. He visited her bed less often, his gaze wandering through the court. In 1526, she noticed him watching Anne Boleyn, a young maid with dark hair and a captivating smile. Catherine held her silence, though her heart bled. One winter night in 1527, as Henry slept drunkenly by the fire, she slipped into his study and opened his letter chest. A missive from Pope Clement VII fell into her hands, its shaky script reading, "Should your majesty require cause to annul the marriage, I will grant it." Her hands trembled, tears staining the parchment. But instead of confrontation, she hid it away, clinging to the fading hope that his love might return. That hope shattered in 1531. Henry declared before the court, "My marriage to Catherine is wrong, cursed by God." He cited scripture, claiming that marrying his brother's widow was a sin. Catherine stood before a council of bishops, her voice steady. "I am His Majesty's lawful wife, and I will not surrender my honor." But her words could not sway him. In 1533, he annulled their union, backed by Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, and banished her from court. Catherine was exiled to remote castles like Kimbleton, where damp stone walls and solitude became her world. She spent her final days praying and writing to Mary, Be strong, my daughter, even if the world turns against you. One January night in 1536, she lay on her bed, her breathing faint. She summoned a servant, commanding, "Write to His Majesty that I forgive him, but he will never escape the darkness he has wrought." The letter was sent, but Henry never read it. Catherine died on January 7th, 1536, alone and forgotten. Word reached Henry as he danced with Anne Boleyn at a feast. He paused, a brief silence falling over him, then said, "She is free now." But that night, in his dreams, he saw Catherine standing in the shadows, her blue eyes fixed on him, a silent reminder of what he had lost. Anne Boleyn, the blade, beneath the crown. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the lush fields surrounding Greenwich Palace, casting a golden glow across the grand hall where the English court gathered for a summer feast in 1526. The delicate strains of a lute mingled with the laughter of nobles clad in shimmering silks. Henry VIII, now 35, sat upon a gilded throne at the center of the room, his blue eyes sharp as they scanned the crowd. He still bore the handsome vigor of youth, though his frame had begun to thicken, and the crimson robe embroidered with gold clung tightly to his broad shoulders, a symbol of unyielding power. Amid the throng, a figure stood out like a shadow against the light. Anne Boleyn, 25, had recently returned from the French court, stepping into the hall in a deep green gown with a lace-trimmed neckline. Her long black hair cascaded freely, defying the custom of pinned-up tresses, and her dark brown eyes sparkled like polished obsidian, both alluring and enigmatic. She wasn't the most beautiful woman there. Her sister Mary, once Henry's mistress, outshone her in radiant charm. But Anne possessed something rarer, a razor-sharp wit and a boldness that turned heads. Henry spotted her instantly. As she curtsied in greeting, she rose a fraction too soon, her gaze locking with his. A faint smile curved her lips, not the shy deference of a maid, but the confidence of a woman playing a high-stakes game. His heart thudded, a sensation he hadn't felt since his early days with Catherine. He leaned toward Thomas Wyatt, a poet and secret admirer of Anne, whispering, "Who is she?" Wyatt bowed slightly, his voice low. "Anne Boleyn, Your Majesty, a flower not easily plucked." From that moment, Henry was ensnared. He sent her letters, scrawled in his bold hand, "My heart is yours, grant me a chance." But Anne was no ordinary courtier, eager to fall into his arms for favor. She replied with coy refusals. "I will not be any man's mistress, not even a king's. If you love me, make me your queen." Her challenge ignited a fire in Henry's soul. He vowed to claim her, no matter the cost to his kingdom. To win Anne, Henry upended England. He declared his marriage to Catherine unlawful, defying the Roman Catholic Church's authority. In 1527, he dispatched envoys to Rome, demanding Pope Clement VII annul his union, but the Pope refused, swayed by Spain's influence. Undeterred, Henry turned to Thomas Cranmer, an ambitious religious scholar, and Thomas Cromwell, a cunning statesman, to sever Rome's grip. In 1533, he proclaimed himself head of the Church of England, a seismic act that shook Europe. He divorced Catherine, banished her from court, and cleared the path for Anne. On June 1st, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. She entered in a white gown, threaded with gold, a pearl necklace gleaming against her pale skin. But the air was not thick with joy, as Henry had hoped. The crowd outside stood silent, some muttering witch or husband stealer. Catherine remained beloved, and Anne, with her pride and ambition, became a lightning rod for hatred. Henry took her hand, whispering, "They'll forget her soon. You are all I need." Anne smiled, but deep within, she knew this throne would be hard to hold. Anne's happiness lasted less than a year. On September 7th, 1533, she gave birth to Elizabeth, a healthy girl with Henry's eyes. He visited, offering a strained smile. "You've given me a jewel, but I need a prince." Anne nodded, though worry flickered in her gaze. She understood the weight pressing down on her. Henry needed a male heir to secure his dynasty, and each day without a son widened the rift between them. In 1534, Anne conceived again, but the child died in her womb. In 1535, another miscarriage drove Henry to fury. He roared in a drunken rage, "You lured me in, yet you can't give me what I desire." Anne shot back, her voice trembling, but firm, "I've given you everything, even my honor. You cannot blame me for God's will." Her words only pushed him further away. He began to notice Jane Seymour, a gentle maid in the court, and whispers of Anne's decline swirled through the palace. Meanwhile, Anne's enemies struck. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally in securing the crown, turned against her, fearing her influence threatened his power. He gathered evidence, much of it fabricated, accusing her of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The rumors spread like wildfire, and Henry, ever paranoid, believed them. One night in April 1536, Anne slipped away to the woods near Hever Castle, where she met a mysterious old woman in a black cloak. The hag seized her hand, her milky eyes staring into nothingness, and hissed, "You will fall beneath the axe, but your blood will rule the throne." Anne recoiled, her heart pounding, but kept the prophecy secret. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne was arrested in her chambers at Greenwich Palace. Henry didn't face her, sending guards with a curt order, "Take her to the Tower." She screamed as they dragged her away, "I'm innocent. You can't do this to me." But her cries drowned in the clatter of iron boots on stone. In the Tower's dank cell, she sat hunched on a rough wooden bed, faint light filtering through a narrow slit. She scratched a desperate letter to Henry. "Your Majesty, if I've ever wronged you, forgive me. I only wish to love you and give you what you craved. Don't let me die unjustly." She entrusted it to a maid, but it never reached him. Cromwell intercepted it. On May 19th, 1536, Anne emerged from the Tower, her hands loosely bound behind her. A crowd gathered around the scaffold, their silence oppressive. She wore a plain gray gown, her black hair tied back, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Before kneeling, she turned to the French executioner Henry had summoned from Calais, offering a faint smile. "I have a small neck. It won't be hard to cut. Make it quick, for God's sake." The executioner nodded, and in an instant, the gleaming blade swung downward. Her head rolled onto the wooden platform, blood pooling in crimson rivulets. Henry watched from a distant balcony, his face a mask through the blurred glass. His hands gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened. When word spread through the court, he declared, "She betrayed me, and now I'm free." But that night, he dreamed of Anne standing in the shadows, her brown eyes boring into him with silent reproach. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, feeling a nameless fear for the first time in years. Jane Seymour, a fleeting light. The church bells tolled through the damp air of London, heralding a new day after Anne Boleyn's execution. On May 19th, 1536, as Anne's head rolled across the scaffold, Henry VIII did not linger to savor his triumph. He rode swiftly from the Tower of London to Whitehall Palace, his face an unreadable mask beneath a red-feathered cap. The court whispered that he was ready to erase the memory of the wife he'd condemned, but few knew the void gnawing at Henry's core. Not a void of love, but of an obsession for a male heir. In the grand hall of Whitehall, candlelight danced across tapestried walls as nobles gathered to witness their king's next move. Henry sat on his throne, clutching a silver goblet of wine, his gaze drifting over the assembly. At the edge of the room, a slight figure caught his eye. Jane Seymour, 27, stood quietly among the other maids, her hands clasped before her. She wore a simple, pale blue gown, her blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a linen coif, devoid of lavish jewels or ostentation. Yet it was her quiet demeanor, so starkly opposite Anne's fiery pride, that drew Henry in, offering a rare sense of peace amidst his turmoil. He beckoned Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne's downfall, closer. Henry's voice dropped to a murmur like a breeze through the hall. "Who is she?" Cromwell bowed, replying softly, "Jane Seymour, your majesty, daughter of Sir John Seymour." A pious, discreet, and loyal girl. Henry nodded, his eyes lingering on Jane. "I need peace, Cromwell, and I need an heir. Arrange for me to meet her." Jane was unlike the women who had come before her. She didn't captivate Henry with sharp words or daring glances. Instead, she listened in silence, her pale blue eyes radiating sincerity. Their first meeting took place in the rose gardens of Whitehall, where blooms blazed red beneath the sun. Henry approached, his crimson cloak billowing, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "Do you fear me, Jane?" She looked up, her voice soft but clear. "No, your majesty. I only fear I might fail in my duty if you choose me." The simplicity of her words, devoid of flattery, made Henry smile, a rare smile untainted by arrogance. Just 11 days after Anne's death, on May 30th, 1536, Henry married Jane in a private ceremony at the Queen's Closet in Whitehall. There were no grand processions or cheering crowds as there had been with Anne. Jane entered in a plain white gown, clutching a small rosary, her face serene as a still lake. Henry took her hand, whispering, "You will be my light, Jane." "I'm weary of darkness." She nodded, but deep within, she knew this light would come at the cost of her life. Life with Jane brought Henry a tranquility he hadn't anticipated. She didn't meddle in politics or vie for power like Anne, nor did she demand attention like Catherine. She preferred stitching by the hearth, reading scripture, and tending to Henry when he returned exhausted from hunts. Once, in the woods near Hampton Court, Henry felled a great stag and turned to Jane, laughing. "This is for you, my love." Jane smiled gently, replying, "You are the finest hunter I've ever seen, your majesty." Her praise, free of artifice, eased the weight on his heart. Everything changed in the spring of 1537. Jane announced her pregnancy, and Henry, now 46, with a body increasingly burdened by weight and a festering leg wound, embraced her in unbridled joy. He shouted in the midst of court, "God has heard my prayers." Over the following months, Jane was treated like a treasure. Henry ordered the palace sealed off from noisy feasts, summoned the best physicians, and ensured her every comfort. Jane, though weary from the pregnancy, remained composed, often sitting by the window overlooking the Thames, her hand resting on her belly as she whispered, "You will be your father's hope." On October 12th, 1537, a child's cry echoed through the birthing chamber at Hampton Court. Jane, after over 2 days of agonizing labor, gave birth to Edward, a healthy boy with pale blonde hair like his mother's. Henry burst into the room, heedless of the maid's protests. He knelt by Jane's bedside, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You've done it, Jane. I have a prince." Jane, frail but smiling, gripped his hand. "I've fulfilled my duty, Your Majesty. Care for our son." Henry kissed her forehead, his heart swelling with a joy he hadn't felt in nearly 3 decades of rule. But that joy was as brief as a lightning flash. Hours later, Jane began to burn with fever, her body trembling from postpartum infection, a scourge even the finest doctors couldn't cure. Henry stayed by her side day and night, his face ashen as he listened to her faint moans. On October 24th, Jane called him close, her voice a fading breath. "Your Majesty, take this locket and forgive." She pressed a small silver locket into his hand, inscribed with the word "fides," meaning faith. Henry clutched it, asking, "Forgive whom, Jane?" But her eyes closed forever, her final breath slipping away. Jane's funeral took place on November 12th, 1537, at Windsor Castle. Henry, clad in rare black, stood silently by her carved wooden coffin. He ordered her buried in a special vault, declaring to the court, "She was my only true wife, who gave me a prince." When the others departed, Henry lingered in the chapel, gripping the silver locket. He muttered, "Forgive whom, Jane? Anne, Catherine, or myself?" No one heard him, but his eyes gleamed with an unspoken pain. That night, Henry returned to Hampton Court, where he had once held Edward in boundless joy. He set Jane's locket on a table, but never wore it. The court whispered that he wept at her passing, but from then on, no one saw his tears again. Jane Seymour, a fleeting light in Henry's stormy life, was gone, leaving him with an heir and a heart grown colder still. In his dreams, he saw Jane standing in a soft glow, her pale blue eyes gazing at him tenderly, but she never spoke a word. Anne of Cleves, The Loveless Marriage. Winter 1539 draped England in a thick shroud of fog, obscuring the spires of Whitehall Palace as a biting chill seeped through its stone walls. Henry VIII, now 48, sat in his privy chamber, his swollen legs propped on a cushioned stool, the chronic ulcer on his thigh throbbing with every heartbeat. His once handsome face was etched with deep lines of time and disappointment, his red hair now streaked with gray beneath the heavy crown. Edward, his son with Jane Seymour, was 2 years old, healthy but fragile, and Henry knew his dynasty still needed shoring up. He sought a new alliance, a new wife, to counter the looming threats of France and Spain across the Channel. Thomas Cromwell, his ever-loyal but calculating minister, entered with a small scroll in hand. He bowed low, his voice steady. "Your Majesty, I have found a perfect match. Anne, Princess of Cleves, from a small but strategic duchy in Germany. She is young, healthy, and this marriage will secure us allies against our enemies." Henry frowned, stroking his graying beard. "I don't want an ugly wife, Cromwell. What does she look like?" Cromwell smiled faintly, unrolling the scroll to reveal a miniature portrait by Hans Holbein. In it, Anne had a serene face, gentle brown eyes, and light blonde hair tucked beneath a silk cap. Henry studied it, nodding slowly. "She's fair enough. Bring her here." Anne of Cleves, 24, had grown up in a modest noble household in Dusseldorf. She spoke no English, was unaccustomed to lavish feasts, but understood her role. This marriage was for peace, not love. When English envoys arrived, she agreed without hesitation, packing a few simple gowns and a silver ring, her mother's last gift, before embarking on the sea journey to England. On January 1st, 1540, Anne disembarked at Dover in a biting wind. She wore a heavy dark green gown, a wide-brimmed hat shielding most of her face, but her brown eyes gleamed with curiosity as she gazed at England's green hills. Henry, eager to meet his bride-to-be, decided to forgo protocol. Disguising himself as a courtier in a plain gray cloak, he rode to Rochester, where Anne rested, intending to surprise her before their official wedding. He strode into her chamber, grinning broadly. "I bring word from the king." "Have you a message for his majesty?" Anne, unaware of his identity, curtsied and replied in halting German, "Bitte, tell him I am honored." Henry laughed, pulling off his cap to reveal himself. "I am Henry. Don't you know me?" But his laughter faded fast. Anne didn't match Holbein's portrait. Her skin was sallow from the journey, her posture stiff, and the scent of her heavy gown made him wrinkle his nose. He turned to a nearby aide, muttering, "She looks like a Flanders mare, not a princess. Cromwell has deceived me." Anne, though she didn't fully understand, sensed the disappointment in his eyes. She bowed deeper, a pang of fear stirring within her. Despite his displeasure, Henry couldn't annul the match without risking war with Cleves. On January 6, 1540, they wed at Greenwich Palace in a brief ceremony. Anne entered in a pale gold gown, her hands trembling as she placed them in Henry's. He gripped them, but avoided her gaze, his voice cold. "We will do our duty, but expect nothing more." That wedding night, Henry left her chamber after mere minutes, retreating to his own rooms and declaring to Cromwell, "I cannot touch her. She isn't what I desired." Their marriage was a loveless charade. Anne endeavored to learn English, smiling at court banquets, but Henry rarely spoke to her. He often departed the palace for hunts or dalliances with other maids, leaving Anne alone in the vast, empty chambers of Hampton Court. She passed her days embroidering, playing cards with her ladies, and writing letters home in German, her words tinged with longing. "I don't know if I've done right, but I must keep peace for my family." One spring day in 1540, Anne overheard two maids whispering in the palace gardens. One hissed, "The king hates her. They say he wants to divorce her for a younger girl." Anne froze behind a shrub, clutching the silver ring from her mother. She recalled a warning from a servant in Cleves before her voyage. "Be careful, my lady. Henry's wives don't last long." But instead of fear, Anne resolved, "If he doesn't want me, I'll find a way to survive." On June 24th, 1540, Cromwell approached Anne with a strained smile. He bowed. "My lady, His Majesty wishes to end this marriage. He says it was never consummated, and he needs another wife." Anne met his gaze, her voice calm. "If that is His Majesty's will, I consent. But I wish to remain in England, to live in peace." Cromwell, surprised by her composure, nodded. "I will arrange it." On July 9th, 1540, the marriage was annulled. Henry, without meeting Anne in person, sent her a short letter. "I thank you for your cooperation. You shall be my sister, and I will not leave you wanting." Anne was granted the title, the King's Sister, a generous annuity, and estates like Hever and Richmond to reside in. She smiled as she read the letter, knowing she had escaped the axe that had claimed Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Anne lived out her remaining years in tranquility, a rarity among Henry's wives. She mastered English, hosted small gatherings at Richmond, and befriended Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. At a Christmas feast in 1541, Henry made an unexpected visit. He entered, his bulk heavier than ever, laughing heartily. "You look healthier now that you're not my wife, Anne." She curtsied, replying, "Your Majesty, I am happy to live as I please." Henry nodded, a flicker of regret in his eyes, but said no more. Anne died on July 16, 1557, at Chelsea Manor, aged 41, outliving all of Henry's other wives. Before her death, she gave her mother's silver ring to a trusted maid with a note, "Keep it as a reminder that survival is sometimes the greatest victory." Henry, dead for a decade by then, never knew that Anne, the wife he once scorned, had found a freedom he could not take. In his final dream, before death, Henry saw Anne standing in the mist, her brown eyes gazing at him without reproach or love, only calm indifference. He awoke with a start, but never spoke of that vision. Catherine Howard. The Flame of Youth. The summer of 1540 blazed over the fields surrounding Hampton Court, where birdsong mingled with the laughter echoing from lavish court banquets. Henry VIII, now 49, lumbered through the palace in a crimson robe, leaning on a wooden cane to support his bulk and aching legs, plagued by a festering ulcer that refused to heal. His once red hair had faded to a silvery gray, his face etched with deep lines, but his blue eyes still burned with a longing, not for power, but for the youth that had long slipped away. Jane Seymour had been dead for 3 years. Anne of Cleves had just been cast aside. And though Henry had Edward, he felt an emptiness gnawing at him. In the great hall of Hampton Court, sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the polished stone floor where young maids danced to the strains of a harpsichord. Henry sat on his throne, stroking his beard, his gaze suddenly fixing on a petite girl, barely 19. Catherine Howard, cousin to Anne Boleyn, twirled in a blush-pink gown that hugged her slender frame, her chestnut curls bouncing free, her green eyes sparkling like wildfire. She danced with the carefree joy of youth, laughing as she spun, and Henry felt his heart thud, a sensation he thought had died with Jane. He summoned Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and Catherine's uncle, to his side. Henry's voice was low, tinged with excitement. "Who is she?" Norfolk bowed, a sly smile on his lips. "Catherine Howard, my niece, Your Majesty. A fresh flower, innocent and ready to serve you." Henry nodded, his eyes never leaving Catherine. "I want her, Norfolk. Arrange it." Within days, Catherine was presented to Henry in a private meeting in the Rose Garden. He approached, his breath labored, but his smile radiant. "You're as lovely as a rose without thorns, Catherine." She curtsied, her voice clear as a bell. "I'm honored by your notice, Your Majesty." Henry laughed, taking her hand, and in that moment he decided she would be his wife. On July 28, 1540, just 3 weeks after annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry wed Catherine at Oatlands Palace in a discreet ceremony. He wore a red tunic threaded with gold, standing as straight as his frail body allowed, while Catherine entered in a white silk gown, her face glowing like the sun. Henry pulled her into his arms after the vows, whispering, "You'll make me young again, Catherine. I've found new joy." She giggled, but her eyes flickered with a hint of bewilderment. She didn't yet grasp the price of being queen. Catherine brought a spark to Henry's life. He threw extravagant feasts where she danced before the court, her lithe waist swaying to the music. Henry showered her with opulent gifts, an emerald necklace, gold rings studded with gems, calling her my treasure. Once, in the privy chamber, he pulled her onto his lap, laughing heartily. "You're a tonic for this old heart." Catherine laughed along, but her hands trembled slightly under the weight of his attention. Yet Catherine wasn't like Jane or Anne of Cleves. She was youthful, impulsive, and her heart didn't fully belong to Henry. At court, her eyes began to wander to Thomas Culpeper, a dashing gentleman with dark hair and a charming smile. They exchanged stolen glances at banquets, and one night in March 1541, Culpeper drew her into a shadowed corner of Hampton Court's gardens. He whispered, "You deserve real love, not an old king." Catherine blushed, replying, "I can't betray His Majesty." But when Culpeper kissed her, she didn't pull away. The secret affair between Catherine and Culpeper deepened. They met in hidden rooms, passing short notes scrawled on thin paper. Catherine, caught in the throes of youthful passion, didn't see the danger closing in. But the court never slept. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, received a tip from a former maid who had served Catherine before her rise. The maid revealed Catherine's past dalliances with Henry Mannix, a music tutor, and Francis Derham, a secretary, during her time in Norfolk with her grandmother. Cranmer, no friend to the Howard family, brought the accusation to Henry. On November 1st, 1541, Henry was playing cards in the privy chamber when Cranmer entered, holding a rolled parchment. He bowed, his voice grave. "Your Majesty, I have evidence that the Queen has betrayed you, not only before your marriage, but with Thomas Culpeper, here in this palace." Henry snatched the parchment, reading the damning words, his face flushing red, then draining to a ghostly white. He roared, "Betrayed me!" Again. He slammed the table, toppling a goblet of wine that spilled crimson across the floor, then growled, "Arrest her! I want the truth." Catherine was seized the next day while giggling with her ladies in her chambers. Guards burst in, dragging her from her chair, and she screamed, "What have I done? Let me go." They took her to the Tower of London, locking her in a frigid cell with a single narrow window, letting in faint light. Inside, Catherine sobbed, begging to see Henry, but he refused to come. One night, she slipped to the desk, her trembling hand scribbling a plea on a scrap of paper. "Your Majesty, I erred, but I love you. Forgive my weakness." She handed it to a maid, but Cranmer intercepted it, determined to see the Howards fall. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine emerged from the tower, her hands loosely bound, her gray gown tattered around her trembling frame. A crowd gathered around the scaffold, whispering of her innocence and folly. Henry stayed away, drowning his pain in wine and hunts at Hampton Court. Catherine knelt, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she lifted her head to the executioner. "I die a queen, but I would rather die Culpeper's wife." The crowd gasped, and the executioner, with steady hands, raised his axe. The cold steel sliced through the air, and Catherine's head fell, her blood pooling red on the wooden boards. Word reached Henry 2 days later, as he sat by a fire with a goblet of wine. He sat in silence for a long moment, then murmured, "She betrayed me, but I loved her." The night, he dreamed of Catherine standing in the shadows, her green eyes gazing at him with both reproach and sorrow. He awoke with a start, sweat beading on his brow, feeling a loneliness deeper than ever before. Culpeper and Derham were executed soon after, but their blood brought Henry no solace. Catherine Howard, the flame of youth that had briefly rekindled his spirit, had burned out, leaving him with a heart colder than ever. Catherine Parr, the clever survivor. The summer of 1543 cloaked Whitehall Palace in a stifling heat, but the tension within its walls felt heavier than the humid air. Henry VIII, now 52, slumped on his throne in the great hall, his obese frame straining the carved wooden seat, his swollen legs aching from a chronic ulcer that festered relentlessly. His once red hair had thinned to a wispy silver beneath his crown, his face a map of wrinkles carved by time and the scars of 5 failed marriages. Catherine Howard had been dead for over a year, and Henry, though still ruling with an iron fist, felt more like a shadow of the king he once was, a man in need of care more than passion. Among the maids standing quietly around the hall, one woman stood out not for beauty, but for her calm presence. Catherine Parr, 31, wore a modest dark blue gown, her brown hair neatly tucked beneath a simple cap, her gray eyes reflecting wisdom and patience. She was twice a widow, having married older men before, and now caught the eye of Thomas Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother. But fate had other plans, thrusting her into Henry's gaze. One afternoon, as she read in the palace gardens, Henry approached, his voice raspy but warm. "You enjoy books, Lady Parr?" Catherine looked up, smiling faintly. "Yes, Your Majesty. Books are my truest friends." Henry nodded, a spark of surprise in his eyes. "I need such a friend. You will be my wife." Catherine didn't want this marriage. She loved Thomas Seymour, but Henry's offer was a command she couldn't refuse. On July 12th, 1543, they went in the Queen's closet at Hampton Court. Henry, in a red tunic threaded with gold, took her hand, whispering, "You'll care for me, Catherine, and mend my family." She bowed, replying, "I'll do my utmost, Your Majesty." But inwardly, she knew she was stepping into a perilous game. Catherine was unlike Henry's previous wives. She wasn't youthful like Catherine Howard, proud like Anne Boleyn, or meek like Jane Seymour. She was intelligent, seasoned, and held reformist religious views, a rarity in a conservative court. She tended to Henry with astonishing devotion, dressing his festering leg sores, sitting by him for hours when pain kept him awake. One night in the privy chamber, Henry gripped her hand, his voice faint. "You're my balm, Catherine. I've never had anyone like you." She smiled, replying, "I only wish you well, Your Majesty." Her greatest role was healing Henry's fractured family. She invited Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward to live at court, hosting small gatherings to bring them closer to their father. Once, in Whitehall's gardens, she taught Elizabeth Latin poetry, while Edward played nearby, with Henry watching. He gazed at the scene, a rare smile breaking through. "You've done what 5 others couldn't." Catherine bowed her head, but remained vigilant. The court was rife with enemies, and her reformist leanings were a dangerous secret. She kept a forbidden book, a work by the reformer John Calvin, hidden in her personal chest. She read it at night, the flickering candlelight dancing across thin pages, believing the church needed change. But her boldness nearly cost her life. In 1546, Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester and a staunch conservative, learned of her interests. He whispered to Henry during a feast, "The Queen reads heretical books, Your Majesty. She may be a threat." Henry, ever suspicious, furrowed his brow. Bring me proof. On July 18th, 1546, Catherine was in her chambers when guards burst in, holding a warrant signed by Henry. She gasped, the forbidden book slipping from her hands, but she swiftly tucked it into her skirts. Her voice trembled, yet held firm. What have I done to be treated thus? The captain replied, My lady, you're accused of heresy. Come with us. She was confined to a temporary cell within the palace, where she knelt in prayer, her heart pounding. She knew the fates of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. If Henry believed her a traitor, death was certain. But Catherine didn't surrender. When brought before Henry the next day, she knelt, tears streaming, but her voice steady. Your Majesty, if I've erred, it's only to learn from you. I meant no defiance to you or the Church. Henry studied her, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had once cherished her intellect, and now her humility touched the last shred of humanity within him. He waved a hand, barking at Gardner nearby. You dare slander my wife? Begone. The warrant was revoked, and Catherine was freed. She bowed, whispering, Thank you, Your Majesty. But inwardly, she knew she'd just danced on the edge of a razor. Henry died on January 28th, 1547, at Whitehall Palace. He lay on his bed, his breathing shallow, clutching Catherine's hand. He rasped, You've done well, Catherine. Care for my children. She nodded, tears falling, not from love, but relief. As Henry exhaled his last, Catherine stood, her face calm. She had survived his reign, a feat 4 of his prior wives hadn't achieved. After Henry's death, Catherine was free to live as she wished. She married Thomas Seymour just 6 months later, despite court disapproval. They lived happily for a brief time at Sudeley Castle, where Catherine, at 35, bore her first child. But joy turned to tragedy. On September 5th, 1548, she died of postpartum infection after delivering a daughter, leaving Thomas in despair. Before her death, Catherine summoned her closest maid, handing her a small box containing the forbidden Calvin book. She whispered, Keep it, and remember that wisdom can be the only weapon for survival. She was buried in St. Mary's Chapel at Sudeley, her simple tomb inscribed Catherine Parr, last Queen of Henry VIII. In Henry's final dream before his death, he saw Catherine standing by his throne, her gray eyes watching him, not with blame, but with strange compassion. He awoke with a start, murmuring, You were the only one who understood me. But he never spoke of that vision. Henry's legacy. Henry VIII died, leaving behind an England forever altered. The Church of England was born from his desperate pursuit of love and heirs, and his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, ascended the throne in turn, shaping history in ways none could foresee. His 6 wives, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, each left a mark, a tale of love, betrayal, and survival. He was buried beside Jane Seymour at Windsor Castle, but his legacy was not just the throne. It was the scars he etched upon the hearts of those women. In history's shadows, was Henry a great king or a tyrant? No answer is certain. But each night, in dreams he never shared, he saw 6 faces gazing at him, loving, hating, forgiving. A reminder that power could never erase loneliness.